What's up, everyone? Welcome back to another LOB format video. This is Ben from YGO from Zero. And today I'm going to do something a bit different to sort of close out the format discussion. This is going to be my last video discussing LOB format, unless you all want more. If you want to see more videos featuring this format, please let me know in the comments down below, and I'll do my best to make one. But as it is planned, this is my last LOB format video. So to cap it all off, I'm planning on just summing up the format in a tier list for the decks. So I'm planning on ranking all the decks that I think can feasibly win a game and that I think are different enough strategies to merit being their own deck. So I'm not going to be distinguishing between aggro with 2 armed ninjas in the main and aggro with 3 armed ninjas in the main, because I think those are close enough to just being the same deck. So before I start ranking these, I just want to quickly explain what each of these tiers mean. So tier 0 refers to a deck that is the undisputed king of the format. This deck can't be beaten by anything besides itself, and it's just incredibly strong, and there's no real counter strategy to it. It's just the best deck. Then we have tier 1. These are just the very good decks in the format, even the best decks in the format if there's no tier 0 deck. And they're the decks that they're most likely going to win if you play them well, and the matchup is somewhat favorable. Then we have tier 2, which I use here to refer to decks that are okay. They can win games somewhat consistently, but they're not the best of the best. They're not the cream of the crop. They still lose more often than not to the top decks in the format, even though they can take a game here or there. Rogue strategies are the strategies that are not very good, but they can still win. You know, they're not the worst thing in the world. If you play them and you play them well, you know, you can expect to win a couple games, but also expect to lose a couple games as well. And then lastly, we have trash. And trash decks are decks that most of the time they're just going to lose. You can get lucky and win with them occasionally, but you got to get real lucky, and most of the time you're just going to lose. As a note, I have neglected to include on this tier ranking decks that I think just can't win at all. So, for instance, the stall deck that just its goal is to make your opponent run out of cards, I don't think that deck can win at all, so it's not on the list. The aggro decks that are focused on tribal strategies that just aren't good. So an aggro strategy that just plays Umi for his tribe, that in my mind cannot win, since you have to play so many terrible beaters compared to the main aggro deck. So that just can't win in my mind, so it's not on the list. So I've boiled down the list to 6 decks that I think meet these criteria. Now in future formats there will be way more, and so this sort of tier ranking will be a lot more useful. But for now, there are only 6 decks that I can reasonably say can win a game or two. And let's just start from the top. The first deck I want to mention is the Tribute deck. So this deck is an aggro deck that aims to get big tribute monsters on the field, either 2 tribute monsters like Blue Eyes White Dragon, or 1 tribute monsters like Curse of Dragon, and use those as their premier boss monster beat sticks. I'm gonna just put this in trash. I didn't feature it in a video, and for good reason. This deck, the tribute monsters just sort of rot in your hand, unusable most of the time. And even when you do manage to summon them out, they can just die to a trap hole, die to any removal on your opponent's turn. They're just not very good. Even though, you know, if you summon out Blue Eyes and your opponent's at less than 3,000 life points, it sticks to landing, you use removal on their field. You know, you can win a game, but most likely you're not going to win on the merits of the tribute monsters. They're most likely not going to do anything for you and put you at a major disadvantage. So I'm putting this in the trash tier because while it can win a game or two occasionally if you get very lucky, most of the time it's just going to be a much, much worse version of aggro. Next up, we have, in my opinion, the best deck of the format in Exodia. Now, you might think that this maybe could be a tier 0 deck because there aren't really many ways to counterplay against it, especially if this Exodia deck can smokescreen into an aggro strategy and thus counter the counter to it. I actually am going to put it in tier 1. And the reason for that is that the Exodia deck depends largely on luck. Not largely, but it depends a fair bit on luck. If you get really unlucky and 3 of one particular piece of Exodia are just at the very bottom of your deck, then you have no way to win. And your opponent, if they're playing an aggro strategy, can generally get enough damage on board to kill you before you draw Exodia. And also, you know, if the aggro strategy draws all the right cards and you're just drawing duplicate Exodia pieces, it can manage to break through your defenses in that case as well. So I'm going to put it in tier 1. I do still think it's the best deck in the format. I just don't think it's unbeatable. I think it's solidly at the top of tier 1. Moving on, we have Fusion, another deck that I did not make a video about, and for good reason. It is actually, in my opinion, worse than Tribute Monsters. Sure, Fusion Monsters don't die to Trap Hole, but in exchange for that, you have to use up more resources most of the time, and you have to play more unplayable monsters. The only good Fusion monster is Guy the Dragon Champion. In order to play that, you need to play 2 Tribute Monsters, and it's basically a worse version of the Tribute strategy, in my opinion, even though it does dodge Trap Hole. So I'm going to put it in trash beneath the Tribute Monster strategy, although realistically, they both just rely on luck to win. Just drawing all the pieces that you need to actually manage to kill your opponent with your big monsters without them having a chance to retaliate. So I'm going to put it in the same level of Tribute Monsters, but slightly below. Next up, we have Equip Tribal. So what I mean by this is a tribal strategy that is an aggro deck, and it uses equip spells to give its monsters an edge. I didn't play a version of this deck because I thought it was too similar to the regular aggro build. So I didn't think it would make for an interesting video, especially if I never just drew the equip spells, then the deck would just literally be an aggro build. But I do think the deck is okay. I think that my equip spell of choice would actually be Raised Body Heat, because I think that does the most, equipping to a Uraby and letting the Uraby hit over Skull Redbirds and other Urabys is slightly more value to me than playing a Follow Wind and letting your Skull Redbird hit over other Skull Redbirds. And also, I think that using equip spells on the 1400 beaters is not the best strategy, especially when you could just use a field spell strategy, which we will get to later. But I think this deck's okay. It most of the time just plays like a regular aggro deck, and when it does draw the equip spells, those are sort of just like a different form of removal spell. The only thing is that the equip spells are not as generic as most removal spells, and so it is a bit worse than regular aggro. So I am going to put it in tier 2. But I do think it's an okay deck. It's a solid deck. And it's for those people who just want a bit more spice in their aggro deck. Moving on, we have standard aggro. And this is just the aggro deck that I featured in all those videos. Just, you know, boiling down to the bare essential cards, bare essential beat sticks, all the removal spells that you could want. Defenders, Man-Eater Bugs, Armed Ninjas. In my opinion, this deck is the second best deck in the format. I think Exodia can win more games than this one can, but I do think this deck is pretty good and the best of all the aggro strategies. So I am going to put it in tier 1. I think it is a very good deck, but I am going to put it below Exodia just because I think Exodia can win more often, especially if they're doing their side decking shenanigans. And now we're at the last deck in the format that I feel is reasonable to rank on this list. So don't at me, zombie fans who want to play the 13th Grave and Violet Crystal. I don't count that as a deck. Last deck we're going to talk about is Field Spell Tribal. And I showed this off in a video before featuring Sogen, the Sogen version of the deck. And I do think that the Sogen version is the best version of Field Spell Tribal. And I do think it's pretty good. I think that, like the Equip Spell Tribal, it is very similar to a regular aggro deck. But I do think that, unlike Equip Spell Tribal, I think that this version of the Tribal deck does let its buff card, Sogen, stay around for longer than something like an Equip Spell would. And so I think it's a bit better than the Equip Spell strategy. So I am going to put it in tier 2, and I am going to put it above the Equip Spell strategy. Now, the reason it's not in tier 1 is that while I think it can win a fair amount of games against a regular aggro strategy, it's just the Sogens are a bit too situational. And so I think the regular aggro strategy does win more often than the Sogen version. But it's still a fun deck. It's a great deck for people who, again, want to play an aggro strategy that's a bit more interesting than just playing all the sort of core cards in this format in one deck. But that's my ranking for this format. You'll notice that I don't think there's a tier 0 deck in this format, although Exodia I do think comes close. And also there just aren't really enough decks to make Rogue a meaningful category, in my opinion. You could potentially put Tribute Monsters and Fusion in Rogue, but I just think those strategies are just too bad to even reach Rogue. I think they're just trash level, even though they can win games here or there. But if you have any disputes with me over this, if you think that I should have ranked something differently, then please let me know in the comments below. And keep in mind that these are largely my personal rankings. This format, again, is not really played at all because it's sort of not really an official format. The game was in its infancy and there were no tournaments for this particular card pool without a limited list. So this kind of isn't an official format. It's just more of an interesting thing that you can play. Just if you want to see what it was like when there was just the first pack released. So these rankings really just reflect my own testing of the format and testing the format out with some friends. I think that the conclusions that I've come to are the correct conclusions for the format. But if people want to explore this format more, they may find strategies that I didn't even consider, or they may find that certain decks are much better than I give them credit for. And if that does happen, I will happily revise this tier list. And if you do testing in this format and find out that, maybe Sogen Tribal is just the undisputed best aggro deck after all, and that I should really swap around some of these rankings, then please, again, let me know in the comments below. But as is, this is going to be my last video in LOB format. This is supposed to be the sort of capstone of this whole experience here. And from here on out, we're going to be moving into the next format that I'm going to tentatively call SYK format for Starter Deck Yugi Kaiba. I can't call the format Yugi Kaiba because that is the format directly after SYK format. So I'm planning on putting out a guide for SYK format relatively soon, but it probably won't come tomorrow. I still have some things I need to test, some deck matchups that I need to play to sort of see how they match up. But expect that within a week probably. And if you'd like that to be a long video like the LOB format guide was, please let me know. If you'd like it to be broken up into chunks, please let me know about that too. But until then, this has been YGO from Zero covering LOB format for the last time on the channel. And I look forward to seeing you in SYK format.